Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm finally talking about the new final album from Klaus Schulze, Deus, Arrakis. Alright then, at long last, it is finally time for me to pay tribute to one of the great 70s synth masters who just recently passed away this past April. Klaus Schulze was a legendary German ambient composer and among the earliest pioneers in the Berlin School style. He was a founding member of Tangerine Dream, even though he was only in the band for their first album, and he was a founding member of Ashra Temple. I obviously wasn't there to see his classics when they were new. I was born in the mid-90s. I can only speak from my own perspective and not from the perspective of any older viewers who might show up here. So, sorry about that. But Schulze's music does go further back with me, personally, than you'd think. I first came across his work in my early high school years through his collaborations with fellow late synth master Pete Namlook in the Dark Side of the Moog series of albums, and eventually got into some of his classic solo work shortly after. I have made multiple previous attempts to sit through his entire studio album back catalog on my own time over the years, though I've never been successful until doing work for this video. I'd too easily get overwhelmed and later distracted by other things, not just because of the size of his back catalog, but also because of the nature of his music itself. Thing is, Schulze is an ambient composer, and most of his albums are very monolithic and long-winded, with progression happening very slowly over compositions that individually average around like 20 minutes each. Some projects, especially early on in his career, can be quite difficult in patience testing. But he's got some legit masterpieces. I highlighted his 1976 album Moon Dawn when I made my 40 more greatest electronic albums of all time video a few years back, and I stand by that. And even if I didn't get into him back in the day on the same level as I did for someone like Jean-Michel Jarre, I discovered him like right around the same time, and always saw him as equal in importance to the evolution and formation of electronic music as we know it today. He's got a couple of individual albums that I do really have that deeper nostalgia connection with, and the announcement of his death honestly got to me a lot more than even Vangelis, who is also equally important to the genre and is a lot more widely known, but I didn't properly get into until last year. Now, I had already been planning on covering this latest album of his here before the announcement of his passing, but now that this will be his final studio album, this video became a lot more important. And of course, I will be doing the full In Brief segment in his honor, though it is worth noting that this man was monstrously prolific. Even for an artist who's been at it since the early 70s, his output can make the output of his colleagues who've been around just as long seem comparatively scant. That's why I'll be primarily keeping this segment limited to what are widely considered his main solo studio albums. That's not including any of his La Vieille Electronique compilations or original compilation box sets, which in themselves triple or even quadruple his output alone. There exists a box set called The Ultimate Edition, which fits most of the above-mentioned compilation material in one release, and could only be fit on 50 CDs. Yes, 50, and that's only most of it, not all of it. As you might surmise, I don't feel like I have time for all that. I'm also not including any of his albums released under the alias Richard von Fried, his collaboration albums, or his live albums either. Even though his live albums are technically also original material, it'll just get to be too much. But even after skipping over all of that, that'll still leave a solid 27 releases to go through, and probably once again breaking the record for my longest In Brief segment to date. But if anyone's going to hold that record, I feel like Schulze absolutely deserves it. Someone as toweringly important to the history of electronic music as he is deserves a deeper breakdown of this towering size, so here we go. Here's my thoughts on his discography, or a decent enough chunk of it. So his first solo album here from 1972 is a bit of a weird, non-indicative start to his story. While it does carry some electronic aesthetics in many parts, it doesn't actually use a single synthesizer. Coming closer to musique concrète, it's monolithic drones created with the use of a modified electric organ, recordings of orchestral compositions and tape manipulations thereof, although its separation into two 20-minute improvisational pieces, with one 5-minute piece in the middle, is an approach to album structuring that would echo through his entire catalog to come. Anyway, I'm not the first to make this comparison, but listening to Irrlicht is like watching the beginning of the universe or staring into a black hole. It's an extremely slow but emotionally intense and harrowing listen. Like all of his albums, it's absolutely not going to be for everyone, but I think it holds up very well for what it is and would still mark it as a classic. This is his first album to actually use synthesizers, although compositionally it's in pretty much the same territory as his debut. 4 20-minute compositions, which are just as monolithic and cosmic as you'd expect, ranging from slow-building synths to more modulated orchestral recordings. Again, absolutely not what I would call an easy listen, and the pacing on this one can be too slow even for me. It is the epitome of drone music with barely anything going on over an hour and a half and not designed for in-depth listening. But I do still think the album is very solid for what it is. The last two movements, Kromengel and Neuronengesang, are my favorites, and they can get pretty epic. Now here's another first for Schulze. This album has drums on it, and an opera singer on the last track. The 3 tracks on here don't feel like they thematically fit together as seamlessly as on Irrlicht and Cyborg, but the wider variety and texture is appreciated. And on this one, his synth equipment saw a noticeable upgrade, much less primitive sounding here than on the previous ones. You can see some textures which would pave the way for what Jean-Michel Jarre did a year later on Oxygen, and some squelching synths sound kinda like TB-303s before those were invented. Oh, and his drumming on Mental Door freaking slaps. Right, this one is arguably his most famous and widely celebrated work, at the very least among his most popular thanks to being his only classic period album to be widely available in the United States for many years. A tribute to Richard Wagner, it's an album all about getting you to lose your sense of time among a sea of dramatic synth chords and sequences, and the 2 pieces here barely progress at all over the course of like a half hour each. And while it sounds great in all the same ways 70s synth albums do and has the deeper emotional resonance to back itself up, every time I put this on I've always felt like it was all a bit too light and monolithic for my liking. Still a classic anyway, and still very good, but out of all his big, iconic classic 70s albums, this is probably my personal least favorite. Now, if you want my favorite of his classic period work, it's this one. Building upon all the sonic progression he'd made up to this point to create a fantastic epic journey of an ambient record, its 2 tracks have their more subtle moments, but build up to so much more satisfying heights, filling its mixes of spacey synth ambience with jamming drum performances and driving bass arpeggios and samples of male choirs, combining all the strengths of his previous 5 albums and taking them to a new level. If you only listen to one solo album of his, make it this one. It is probably the best starting point into his catalog that you could go with. And here we have a soundtrack to a porn movie. For what it's worth, this is the only soundtrack album that I will be going over in this marathon. He did a couple of others, but this one always seems to be marked as a main album with much more importance than later projects like Angst or Next of Kin. Probably because this was still in his classic pioneering era and you wouldn't be able to tell that this was a soundtrack if nobody told you. It's structured just like all his other albums. With that said, if I do have to consider this a main album, it's easily my least favorite he put out in the 70s. It's just kind of a repeat of what he did on Moondawn with markedly worse production. It's still fun enough if you want more of that. It's just not a big iconic classic comparable in importance to the albums that led up to it. Or this next one. Okay, this is kind of like what he did on Time Wind, but I think this is a major improvement upon it. It's similarly very ambient-centric and slow-paced, but this feels like it has much more going on. The 2 tracks have some noticeable evolution over time, as demarcated by having 6 blurry subsections each. It's subtle but effective, doing well to capture a much colder and more wintry vibe, and it feels much more emotionally involved as well. Also, I think this was the first solo Klaus Schulze album I ever listened to back when I was just starting out high school and getting into ambient music for the first time. I wasn't crazy about it as a kid, but it's undoubtedly benefited from having a few extra years to grow on me, and I'd mark it as a big personal favorite as well. Oh yeah, he also made a sequel to the Body Love soundtrack, which isn't directly connected to the movie and is just a regular original mainline album from what I understand. It's also significantly better than the first Body Love. The 3 tracks here are much more distinct from each other, like the initial Pink Floydish tone and gradual build-ups of the first cut, the banging heaviness of the second one, and the creepy dark ambience of the third, all adding up to the same epic 70s synth goodness that he's known for. Again, I wouldn't put it on par with like the big classics like Moon Dawn, Mirage, or the next album, but if you're curious, it is worth a shot. I was pleasantly surprised by this. This is arguably the last of his big classics, and also the last of his albums that I have a longer running personal history with, aside from one of his 80s albums, which I'll get to. But yeah, this album is fantastic too. A lot of it does sit pretty stylistically close to what he did on Moon Dawn, with all the usual long-form jams, drumming and driving arpeggios, but this one also incorporates a lot of orchestral samples into the mix as well. And there's an interesting concept here too, where each of the 6 tracks is named after a historical figure that Schulze was influenced by in some way. Well, Frank Herbert is not a historical figure, but he was a major inspiration for Schulze, as we'll get into more with the album after this. Now, this album is nearly 2 hours long, so maybe not a great starting point, but every time I've put it on, I have had a suitably mesmerizing experience, and I would absolutely consider it one of his best. Alright, from this point in his catalog onwards, I'm hearing pretty much all of this stuff for the first time, and this is the last of his 70s albums, of course directly inspired by and named after Frank Herbert's famous science fiction series. And it's a weird one. Most notable for the second track, Shadows of Ignorance, which features half-spoken, half-sung vocals from Arthur Brown, of all people. A bit of a controversial move that seems to have turned many fans off, though if you're gonna feature any vocalist on a Klaus Schulze album, the God of Hellfire seems like a suitable pick. Also quite like all the cello performances throughout both tracks. Can definitely see why it's not brought up as often as his previous classics, but I still had fun with it. It's good. And welcome to the 80s. Right away, this is a landmark release for Schulze, as it's his first entirely digital recording and his first to be built almost entirely on a computer. Hence the album title and the first track called Death of an Analog. Quite exciting, this computer magic. Production-wise, you can hear the difference right away. Features much less of the warmth of his previous work, unsurprisingly sounds thinner and a lot more 80s-ish. Though compositionally, it's more or less in the same territory as always. As someone whose favorite Tangerine Dream album is Exit, I don't mind the change in sound here as much as most people seem to, but I wouldn't call this one of his stronger or most well-aged efforts either. This was a much smoother sounding attempt at the all-digital approach, though. Carries a lot more of the warmth of his analog work, aided by the cellos. Kinda sounds like the Dune album, but a bit more rhythmic and without Arthur Brown. It's very nice. And I guess this one's somewhere in between the last two, some cuts that have the smoother approach of transfer, some shorter cuts that are surprisingly goofy and dated sounding, and the closer gets really experimental and freaky. The result is kind of like his equivalent to Vangelis' See You Later, but also stretched out to over an hour and a half. I mean, I guess it's fun and varied enough, probably not a keeper though. Not really feeling this one. The production took a noticeable hit here. All the synth settings sound a lot more plain and stock, and the 80s percussion is really weak and generic. The last track is good, some solid, dramatic, psychedelic rambling, but there's really nothing here you need to go out of your way for. I'd probably mark this as his weakest album overall. Kinda like the last album, but better textured, less stock 80s percussion, and more synth harpsichords. And the track Flexible is pretty goofy and out of place, as are Ian Wilkinson's vocals on the last track. Arthur Brown, that guy ain't. But the rest is decent enough, I guess. The title track is probably the biggest highlight. Okay, so you know how I said there was one album he put out in the 80s that I've had some mystery with? Yeah, it's this one. I picked this up way back at the same time that I picked up Mirage because I thought the album cover and title looked cool, and honestly found it to be a much more immediately gripping listen than Mirage at the time. Coming back to it, I was somewhat worried it wouldn't hold up given how I haven't found his other 80s work as impressive, but no, turns out this is my favorite project he put out in the 80s by a long shot, and the only project he put out in this decade that I put on par with the 70s work. The production still sounds of its time, but it all adds up to something that captures the core appeal of his classic so much better while moving that sound into a new era, the kind of thing that fittingly seems somewhat predictive of what would become trance music a few years later. Maybe these 4 lengthy tracks can run together, but the retro-futuristic atmosphere of it all is too well enveloping for me to be bothered by it. Great return to form here. And now we've entered into the 90s, getting a little bit new age-ish up in here with all the stock MIDI percussion, as per the title, and the semi-operatic guest vocalist on the title track. I wouldn't say it's a must-listen, but I guess it's well-crafted for what it is. Oh boy, really doubling down on the new age-y direction. Got a lot more island-y synth tones and fake guitars. It all sounds about ready to soundtrack some old Discovery Channel nature documentary or something. I suppose his 90s career is going in a somewhat similar direction to Vangelis. I mean, it's still enjoyable enough for what it is, but it's just nothing essential. Next is the world's only full-on electronic opera. Schulze offering instrumentals similar to those he's done throughout this era, with overbearing German opera singing on every track. This is not my thing, but I do have to respect it for being one of the most unique and well-realized ideas he's had in quite some time. Returning to his usual formulas, and okay, this one was cool. A markedly more serene and ambient-centric excursion on average that has less of a new agey texture of Beyond Recall. Still using a lot of MIDI sounds, but I guess they're instead giving me a bit of a similar vibe to Vangelis' Soil Festivities, which I can get behind. Also, he brought on Manuel Gosting to play guitar throughout the Return of the Tempo piece. Good to see them working together again. It is his longest regular studio album yet at over 2.5 hours, and I will not deny that that's a bit much and seriously dampens the chances of me wanting to come back to this. I kinda tapped out through most of the Serenade in Blue piece, but there's plenty of nice progressions and immersive subspaces to justify the rest of it. Probably not essential, but I might mark it as the best thing he put out in the 90s. At least if not for a certain series which completely outclasses it, and actually how about I talk about that real quick? Okay, brief digression here. I know I said I wasn't going to bring up collaboration albums or box sets, but I do feel like I need to make one quick exception and specifically highlight the 11-volume series Schulze did in collaboration with Pete Namlook, The Dark Side of the Moog, released mostly throughout the 90s with a couple of extra volumes in the 2000s. Yes, I have physical copies, except for the 2000s ones, I don't have those. I did not re-listen to this stuff for this marathon outside of a couple of brief previews. I haven't put any of them on in a few years and never even made it around to listening to the last 3 volumes in the series at all, but this series was both my first exposure to Klaus Schulze as well as my first exposure to Pete Namlook. Got into them way back when Namlook was still alive, and I remember having a ton of fun with them at the time. My favorite volumes were the whole run from volume 3 to 6. Phantom Heart Brother, 3 Pipers at the Gates of Dawn, Psychedelic Brunch, and The Final Dat. Yes, all of them are titled after random Pink Floyd references like that. That's how they hooked me in. If you don't feel like you'd have time to listen to the whole series, I believe there is a sampler compilation called The Evolution of the Dark Side of the Moog that you can check out as like a brief overview of what the series has to offer, but all of it is absolutely worth further digging into. Lots of fantastic synth ambience all around and a lot of good memories. Getting back to his main albums, and whoa, this one really breaks from his usual format by looking like a normally paced album. 9 tracks, and only 3 of which break 10 minutes. There's even a few of which are only like 6, 4, or even 3 minutes. Absolutely unheard of. The shorter tracks directly linked together. It's not as off-brand as it looks. But yeah, as for the actual music, it's basically a combination of all the work he did in the 90s. A steady mix of ambient material with lots of MIDI accompaniment and pan flutes that honestly have no right to sound as good as they do, combined with lots of spacey techno material that has a stronger backbeat like his work with Namlook. As you might guess, those are the best parts. Oh, and 2 more opera tracks, which are admittedly the worst parts, but I guess hearing a tenor dramatically intoning "Who gives a shit about the common man" is kinda funny. Overall, pretty solid. Not great all the way through, but has a couple of great moments. Alright, finally getting into the home stretch here. The 2 solo projects he released in the 2000s in particular are a lot more universally acclaimed among fans than you'd expect for an artist 30 years out of his prime. But listening to this, yeah, I can in fact confirm it's great. Much better than most of the stuff he put out through the 80s and 90s. I'd say it's about on par with Entrance. A lot of it focuses on the kind of dramatic ambient techno sounds and styles as seen on the best parts of his last album, but without any of the commercial new age-isms, opera, or stock MIDI accompaniment. There is a singer on the opener, Thomas Coggerman, but that guy has much more of like an otherworldly, ethnic flavor to his voice that fits much better with these instrumentals. And said opener has a really solid amount of progression over 30 minutes. Not gonna lie, I had fun with this from front to back, can definitely hang on to it. But this is the one that all the fans seem to mark as his best later period work. Lots of people marking it as on par with his 70s classics, and a couple of people even marking it as his best work overall. Don't know if I'd go that far myself. I personally enjoyed Moonlake more, but this is still very solid. It's a lot more subtle and stripped back and purely ambient-centric. It's basically a more modernized take on what he did with Time Wind, and possibly slightly better executed than it, or at least about on par with it. So good, if not great for me, and still a cut above much of his 80s and 90s work. Last but not least, the albums he put out in the 2010s. Here we got yet another meaty double album with lots more well-textured and especially lengthy compositions, Got some violins and some vocal accompaniment from Lisa Gerrard of Dead Can Dance fame. She and Schulze did a whole album together in 2008, which I skipped over, but always nice to hear her voice over this kind of music. Perhaps unfortunately, I do think this album runs together too much for my liking, and once again, the 2+ hour length makes me not as keen on the idea of coming back to it. But the production quality is still right on par with his last two, and the 55-minute centerpiece, the Rhodes violin, is the easy highlight. A fantastic understated gem with much more evolution than any other piece here, and makes the album worth it on its own. I might just keep that track and leave the rest behind. Okay, this one's status as a proper album is admittedly kinda shaky. The first track here is an alternate take of the Rhodes violin from the last album, and the last three were all previously released as promotional one-offs on compilations in the 2000s. But it still seems to be regarded as a proper album in spite of that, so I checked it out anyway, why the heck not? And honestly, I'm glad I did. This album is great. Now, this version of the Rhodes violin, retitled Rhodes Romance, is a step down from the original because it takes out all the violins and other extra instrumentation. But the album as a whole benefits quite a bit from the scattershot method in which it was recorded and put together. Each of these tracks has a very distinct identity apart from each other, going from techno to some world music influenced stuff, to some jazz influenced stuff, and then paying off in the most epic way with Andromeda the Grand Trance, which sounded awesome just from that title and very much lived up to the hype. The album is unsurprisingly a lot to take in. It's another double album, but this is one of the first Schulze double albums in a long time that I think justifies enough of its length for me to want to keep around in its entirety. And this is one of the darkest, most haunting and ghostly sounding albums in his catalog. A lot of ambient pads and synth choirs which sound really funereal and sad, but also oddly comforting. And some other more rhythmic, dramatic, synth arpeggio-driven sections to make sure the experience never drags. There are a few short, isolated parts with some kind of weak-sounding MIDI percussion, but I didn't go into this expecting much of it, and it hit a lot more of an emotionally resonant note than I was expecting, so this gets yet another thumbs up for me. Which, at long last, finally brings us to here. Needless to say, no one can say that this man did not live a fruitful life, having put out tons of quality albums over so many decades and continuing to do the things he loved all the way up to the very end. At no point does it ever feel like he lost his passion for making music, and some of his best albums came out pretty late in his life too. Not all his albums are must-listens, obviously, but pretty much anything he did in the 70s is worth hearing. Moondawn, Mirage, and X being my favorites. In the 80s he had Entrance and maybe also Transfer if you like. In the 90s he had all the Namlook collabs, and he even had multiple keepers in the 2000s and beyond. It is really something that he managed to stay consistently fresh sounding in such a late era of his career. He could have gone the route of Tangerine Dream and stagnated for decades, and there was a point I thought he might have been on track to do just that around the mid-early 90s, but instead he found a second wind and picked back up to roughly the same level of qualities of his early stuff. That's pretty miraculous in and of itself. But anyway, I did kind of promise an album review in the title of this video, so that takes us to his final album here, Deus Arrakis, announced while he was still alive but released posthumously. I'll admit that both given the way the album was rolled out and being familiar with the mostly spontaneous way that Schulze approaches music making, I wasn't going expecting this to be some kind of grand final statement on his life like a Black Star or a Donuts. I kinda had a feeling he didn't even make this anticipating it to be his final work. Like, apparently the idea for this album came about when he was approached by Hans Zimmer for a collaboration on the score for the recent Denis Villeneuve remake of Dune. Since Schulze was obviously a huge Dune fan in his own right, what with having dedicated an entire album in the 70s to the books, he was happy to work alongside Zimmer for a bit. He saw his own contributions make the cut for the film proper, and that got him inspired to make another solo album, also directly inspired by Dune, the results of which we have here. I assumed this album would be solid, just as most of his more recent material has been, though I didn't go in expecting to get, like, swept off my feet or anything. And, yeah, I pretty much got what I expected to get. This is not an album that feels like it was specifically designed to handle the circumstances surrounding its release or be the final musical statement for Schulze to have made. It's just another modern period Schulze album that sounds similar to pretty much all the other stuff he's done since the 2000s. And it is weird to think about since I think his previous album, Silhouettes, would have been an even more fitting send-off to Schulze. Like, that was an album that created a mood that seemed to be reflecting on mortality and had more of a sense of somber finality to it. If you traded the release dates of that album with this one, that album likely would have been a significantly more of a gut punch. But at the same time, this obviously isn't like a real tangible criticism I have with this album. Like, how monumentally stupid would it be for me to complain about Schulze not artistically handling his own death perfectly or something like that? As if that isn't something very few artists have even had the luxury to pull off. In any case, Deus Arrakis is still a very good album that works in all the same ways as his modern output has, and it definitely has the emotional heft behind it where I am at peace with the fact that it is his final work. Now, when going through individual tracks on this thing, this album is structured in the same way as the vast majority of Klaus Schulze albums. Just 3 tracks, and the shortest one, Osiris, is 18 minutes long. However, for the digital releases of this project, he was nice enough to split each track into multiple parts to make the experience more easily digestible and easier to break down in my usual format. In some cases, the separation of parts can feel a little bit arbitrary, as seen in the case of the first track, Osiris, which may be split up into 4 parts, but the first 3 fundamentally sound the same and mark points in a gradual linear build-up, and the 4th of which is a minute-long outro. The other 2 tracks on the album have much more distinction between the parts they're separated in, but this one may as well not be separated at all. But still, this track is beautiful. Its build-ups of ambient synth arpeggios and pads and shifting chords start out fairly simple and stripped back and keep intensifying over time. By the time we get to the 3rd section, the piece has entered into some really dramatic territory, one of the warmest and most emotionally impactful moments for the whole album, and the outro feels like a big climactic finish for the piece as well, being limited to just the simplest ambient pads, but still feeling like a satisfying dramatic payoff at the end. Meanwhile, you also got the 2nd track, Seth, as a direct contrast to how we started, the longest piece at over a half hour, but also split up into 7 parts, which technically link together, but feel much more disjointed with much more abrupt transitions. This track is almost kind of more like 7 different related tracks jammed together, but it's also unquestionably the most exciting part of the album. Like, the first part is nothing but tuneless experimental noise, just synths imitating wind blowing over a desert and playing lots of different frequencies and sounding really freaking cool. Part 2 is a very stripped back set of chilling ambient synth chords. Part 3 takes the same chord progression and applies it to a much more rhythmic arrangement with more glittering arpeggios and clattering but low-key beats. Part 4 marks the return of a frequent collaborator and cellist, Wolfgang Tiepold, and creates a strange and experimental subspace out of manipulations of his string performances, one of the coolest sounding moments on the album. Part 5 introduces a key change, but returns to the more energetic synth arpeggios and rhythms as seen in Part 3, while continuing on the cello performances. Part 6 is everything falling away to very limited and quiet pads, but building up quite dramatically again with another pretty intensely emotional cello performance. And then Part 7 finishes the piece on an oddly muted and understated note, with lots of sour bass chords and the cello sounding much darker and more menacing. A very strange piece this entire thing is, but it does really hold your attention well through that entire half hour. The final piece here, Der Hauch des Lebens, is probably my least favorite of the 3, but is still a very effective and fitting way for this album to finish. Its 5 subsections don't run together as seamlessly or feel as arbitrarily selected as on Osiris, but they aren't as disjointed and all over the place as on Seth. The parts here clearly all add up to one greater whole, but their separation points are very logical and mark noticeable changes for the piece. Part 1 and 2 are very stripped back and minimalistic, nothing but very simple synth pads that mildly resemble synthetic choirs, creating a very chilling and mysterious effect, with Part 2 adding in a bit of more texture in the way of these abstract vocalizations. Part 3 is the centerpiece of the track, with an 8-minute buildup of subtle blipping arpeggios building into tapping rhythms, the only part of the piece with any percussion and the most attention-grabbing section. Part 4 returns to the minimal pads of the first 2 parts and plays some much more unresolved-sounding chords. At one point, during my first listen, I looked at my iPod, misread which track I was on, and mistakenly thought this was the ending. And I thought, oh man, that would really suck to end your entire career on what basically sounds like a cliffhanger, to-be-continued kind of ending. Obviously, that is not the ending. I was dumb. Part 5 comes in to resolve all that, returning to some much more dramatic and emotionally satisfying chord progressions that sort of tie back into the sound of Osiris a little bit. It doesn't feel as warm or comforting as that opening piece. There's a part of me who kind of wishes this last piece had traded places with Osiris, but this album is still left off on a suitably satisfying note that feels very nice. And the way I feel about that last part of the track is kind of the way I feel about Deus Arrakis as a complete whole. It's not one of my absolute favorite works of his. I think he's put out other albums in the most recent leg of his career that resonated more deeply with me, such as Moonlake, Eternal, and Silhouettes. But this is about on par with Continuum, maybe? It's still a very solid album, and yet another nice addition to cap off his strong late-period run. Even if Schulze didn't go out with a major bang or a gut punch, he still went out doing what he loved and putting out more solid synth ambience and emotional world building as he has always been known to do, leaving as spontaneously as most of his music came about, and there's something fitting about that in its own right. Godspeed, Klaus Schulze. Thank you for all your decades of service and the incomparable amount you have given to further this entire genre. On Deus Arrakis, I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.